At first, the German looked.
When they first saw the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, Luftwaffe pilots mocked it as the flying milk bottle, a bulky, overweight brute that looked too heavy to fight. In their minds, the American plane couldn't possibly match the elegant, lethal lines of a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. But laughter soon turned to disbelief. In late 1943, after months of brutal air battles over occupied Europe, a P-47 crash-landed behind German lines. The Luftwaffe's technical officers, thrilled by the chance to study this mysterious American monster, quickly secured the wreckage. What they found inside would leave them stunned. As the engineers stripped away the panels and opened the cowlings, they discovered not a crude machine, but an engineering masterpiece.
The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine, 18 cylindres of raw fury, dominated the fuselage.
It was a radial engine so powerful it could lift the 10-ton Thunderbolt to the edge of the stratosphere. The Germans realized something unsettling. This machine wasn't designed around elegance. It was designed around survival. Every inch of the P-47 screamed one message: brute power wins wars. Even before the first test flight, German analysts noted that its supercharger system was unlike anything they had built. The Americans had created a turbo-supercharged beast that could maintain full power above 30,000 feet, far beyond the reach of most Luftwaffe fighters. The engineers who once mocked the Thunderbolt now stared at it in silence, realizing they had underestimated not just an aircraft, but an entire industrial philosophy. When the captured P-47 Thunderbolt arrived at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's top test center, German engineers gathered around it in awe. The massive fighter, freshly repainted with yellow identification markings, looked nothing like their own sleek machines. It was heavy, overbuilt, almost brutal in appearance. Yet as they examined it, they began to realize they were standing before something far beyond their expectations. Chief Test Pilot Hans-Werner Lerche, who had flown more than 125 aircraft types, was assigned to evaluate it. The cockpit shocked him, a maze of gauges, switches, and levers unlike anything in German fighters. Systems like automatic engine control and the turbo-supercharger seemed unnecessarily complex, yet unmistakably advanced. Starting the Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine filled the air with a deep, thunderous growl, not the sharp mechanical whine of a BMW or Daimler-Benz, but the sound of raw, restrained power. At low altitude, the Thunderbolt felt clumsy, just as Luftwaffe reports had described. But above 20,000 feet, everything changed. The turbo-supercharger came alive, feeding the massive radial engine full power while German aircraft gasped for oxygen. By 25,000 feet, Lerche was stunned. The Thunderbolt climbed with force, accelerated past 500 miles per hour in dives, and remained stable even near the edge of compressibility. What German pilots had called sluggish was, at altitude, a predator. The P-47 could roll faster than an FW-190 and dive away from any pursuer. When engineers tore down the aircraft, they found precision everywhere: forged aluminum pistons, sodium-cooled valves, and steel alloys Germany could no longer produce. Every piece reflected an industrial power they couldn't replicate. One engineer summed it up quietly: "We could build something similar, but not enough of them to matter." As weeks turned into months at Rechlin, the German engineers' fascination with the P-47 evolved into something closer to unease. The Thunderbolt wasn't just another enemy aircraft. It was a flying symbol of an industrial philosophy that Germany could neither imitate nor counter. Engineers documented every detail. They weighed every bolt, photographed every line, and charted the airflow across the wings. What they found challenged everything they believed about efficiency. To German minds trained in minimalism and precision, the Thunderbolt seemed wasteful, a machine built without concern for material shortages or production limits. But that was precisely its power. Where the Reich built perfection in handfuls, the United States built excellence by the thousands. The turbo-supercharger system drew particular attention. Its labyrinth of ducts and turbines seemed absurdly complex to engineers accustomed to direct-drive superchargers. Yet its performance at altitude explained everything. This was how American pilots could escort bombers deep into Germany, how they could fight at 30,000 feet with engines still roaring at full power. Reports from Rechlin began circulating quietly through Luftwaffe command. Some officers dismissed the findings, insisting German designs were still superior in the hands of skilled pilots. But others saw the truth. The Thunderbolt was proof that the war was no longer just about aerodynamics. It was about industry, resources, and time. When Hans-Werner Lerche filed his final report, He ended with a single line that said it all. "This aircraft is not built for one pilot. It is built for a nation that can afford to make 10,000 more." By early 1944, reports from Rechlin reached the highest levels of the Luftwaffe's technical command. What began as curiosity had turned into reluctant admiration and growing alarm. The captured Thunderbolt wasn't a marvel of ingenuity in the German sense. It was a manifestation of scale. Every wire, every control lever, every redundant system spoke to an industry that could afford to build aircraft not for economy, but for endurance. German analysts noted that the P-47's turbo-supercharger alone required materials and machining capacity equal to an entire Messerschmitt engine. It was over-engineered excessive, and yet, it worked flawlessly at altitudes that left German fighters gasping. The report admitted, in cautious phrasing, that no comparable German device exists capable of maintaining rated power above 24,000 feet. That single admission hit like a thunderclap across the Luftwaffe hierarchy. For years, Germany had led the world in fighter design, sleek, efficient, deadly. But now, the Reich's most advanced aircraft were being outperformed by a machine its pilots once mocked as a flying milk bottle. Attempts to replicate aspects of the Thunderbolt's performance faltered. German factories lacked the alloys, the precision tooling, and the production depth to manufacture such complex systems at scale. Even experimental efforts to adapt the BMW 801 for higher altitude failed catastrophically under test conditions. For the first time, German engineers began to understand what they were truly fighting. Not just a foreign air force, but an industrial civilization that could mass-produce perfection faster than the Reich could repair its losses. In that realization lay the quiet despair of Rechlin's engineers. They had unlocked the Thunderbolt's secrets, but lacked the means to use them. The Thunderbolt's arrival at Rechlin sparked a flurry of memoranda across the Luftwaffe's technical and operational branches. Engineers dissected the aircraft's systems with surgical precision, while commanders debated what these findings meant for Germany's air war strategy. The consensus was chillingly simple: the Allies had built a fighter the Reich could no longer match, not in performance, and certainly not in production. Some urged that the Focke-Wulf 190 and Bf 109 lines be upgraded with turbochargers to compete at higher altitudes. But in a nation starved for nickel, aluminum, and high-grade steel, the proposal was fantasy. The alloys needed for the Thunderbolt's turbine blades were unobtainable. Factories already crippled by bombing could barely keep up with existing models. At the same time, Luftwaffe intelligence began intercepting more and more reports of Thunderbolt squadrons escorting bombers deep into German airspace, flying higher, faster, and striking harder than ever before. German aces like Adolf Galland admitted privately that the P-47's resilience and firepower made frontal attacks suicidal. The once feared Jagdwaffe was now bleeding pilots faster than it could train them. Meanwhile, at Rechlin, test pilot Hans Lerche continued flying the captured Beetle to gather data. Each flight reinforced the same conclusion, that American aircraft design had become a fusion of brute power and scientific precision. Every bolt seemed engineered for mass production, every subsystem optimized for reliability over elegance. Lerche's reports grew increasingly somber. "We can copy their ideas," he wrote, "but not their factories." The Luftwaffe's leaders faced a reality their pride could not conceal: the Thunderbolt was more than a plane. It was proof that Germany had already lost the war of industry, even before it lost the war of the skies. When the captured Thunderbolts were transported from Rechlin to the Luftwaffe's traveling demonstration unit, Circus Rosarius, they became mobile exhibits of both fascination and dread. The unit's purpose was simple: show frontline German pilots what they were truly up against. On a cold autumn morning in 1944, pilots gathered around a P-47 painted in German markings, its massive propeller looming like a weapon from another world. The technicians fired up the Pratt Whitney R-2800, and the ground shook. The roar of the engine, deep, confident mechanical thunder, left the crowd silent. It was not the sound of clever engineering. It was the sound of industrial supremacy. When Circus Rosarius pilots took the captured Thunderbolt into the air, climbing effortlessly past 30,000 feet and diving with a speed German fighters couldn't match, even hardened aces like Gerhard Barkhorn admitted the truth. "You can feel the weight of America in that engine," he said. The demonstrations, intended to educate, instead sowed despair. Pilots realized that every Thunderbolt destroyed was instantly replaced, sometimes two more arriving before the wreckage cooled. Factories in Michigan, New York, and California turned out hundreds each month, while German plants struggled to replace even a fraction of their losses. The message was unmistakable. The Americans could afford to make mistakes. Germany could not. That understanding spread like smoke through the Luftwaffe. Pilots no longer saw themselves as masters of the sky, but as men flying into an unstoppable storm. For many, the Thunderbolt was no longer just a machine, it was a prophecy. A metal messenger of a truth no one dared speak aloud. Germany's defeat was no longer a question of courage or tactics, but of arithmetic. Inside a dimly lit room at Rechlin's test center, German engineers surrounded a chalkboard crowded with figures, weight ratios, engine pressures, fuel capacity, and top speeds. The numbers were undeniable. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not elegant by German standards, but it was something far more dangerous, efficient. The R-2800 engine could maintain high power output for hours, while the turbocharger system delivered steady performance at altitudes where most Luftwaffe fighters gasped for air. Even the plane's armor, which German engineers once mocked as wasted steel, was now recognized as genius. A Thunderbolt could absorb hits that would tear a Focke-Wulf apart, and still make it home. But what truly crushed the illusion wasn't in the engineering reports. It was in the production charts. The United States had built over 15,000 Thunderbolts, while Germany struggled to maintain output amid bombings and shortages. Every American loss was a statistic, every German loss, a tragedy. Engineers compared fuel logistics next. The Thunderbolt's massive fuel tanks and drop tank design allowed it to escort bombers deep into Germany, something the Luftwaffe had dismissed as impossible. By 1944, B-17 formations were no longer alone. Behind every bomber stream roared dozens of P-47s and later P-51s, turning what had once been hunting grounds for German interceptors into deadly traps. As one Luftwaffe officer wrote in his confidential report, "We no longer fight airplanes. We fight factories." It was a revelation that broke more than morale, it broke strategy itself. For years, Germany had built its war machine around speed, agility, and precision craftsmanship. But America's war machine was built around volume, reliability, and endurance. The Thunderbolt symbolized that philosophy, a flying anvil of unstoppable production. And the more the Germans studied it, the clearer it became. No tactic could outfly the mathematics of American industry. By the spring of 1944, the thunder that once rolled from German engines was fading. Luftwaffe pilots, once the hunters of Europe, were now the hunted. Every mission over France or Germany brought with it a new kind of fear, the fear of the jug. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't stalk its prey with elegance. It roared, it climbed, it dove, a brute force wrapped in armor. German pilots called it der Donnerbolzen, the Thunderbolt, and soon the name carried more weight than any propaganda. They learned quickly that engaging a Thunderbolt on its own terms was suicide. Dive away, and the jug would follow, diving faster, its weight turning gravity into a weapon. Climb, and its turbo-supercharger would keep its engine screaming long after a Focke-Wulf began to choke. Even the Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's pride, struggled to outclimb or outgun it. One Luftwaffe ace recalled bitterly, "When you saw that big radial engine in your mirror, you had two choices, pray or die fast." The Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber machine gun spat out over 13 pounds of lead every second, enough to shred a Messerschmitt to ribbons in a single pass. The sheer volume of fire was terrifying. Pilots described how one burst could saw the wing off an enemy fighter or set a train ablaze on the ground. But it wasn't just the firepower that broke the Luftwaffe, it was the relentlessness. American squadrons filled the sky, wave after wave. When one group of jugs returned to base, another took their place. The Luftwaffe had no rest, no reprieve. For German pilots, the sound of the R-2800 engine became a curse. A deep, roaring growl that meant death was coming from somewhere above. Entire units began avoiding engagements unless absolutely necessary. And behind those Thunderbolts, the bombers kept coming. Day after day. Factory after factory. The Luftwaffe still fought, bravely, skillfully, but the war in the air had turned into a battle of attrition. And against the jug, attrition was a game only America could win. The sky, once the proud domain of the Luftwaffe, now belonged to thunder. As 1944 pressed on, the Thunderbolt's role expanded beyond the clouds. What began as a high-altitude escort fighter evolved into one of the most feared ground attack weapons of the war. Allied commanders realized they had something extraordinary, not just a fighter, but a flying sledgehammer that could devastate targets from above or below. The Jug's thick armor and powerful radial engine gave it a kind of invincibility other planes lacked. While German flak shredded thinner aircraft, the Thunderbolt often limped home riddled with holes, its pilots shaken but alive. Crews soon began to call it the Jug that couldn't die. With its long-range drop tanks and improved fuel systems, P-47s began escorting B-17s and B-24s deep into German territory, missions once considered suicidal. The Thunderbolt didn't just protect bombers, it cleared the skies ahead of them. Luftwaffe fighters that once tore through unescorted formations were now ambushed by squadrons of Thunderbolts waiting like silent sentinels in the sun. And when the bombers turned for home, the Jugs didn't rest. They dove down to tree level, strafing trains, convoys, and communication lines. Entire rail networks were paralyzed. Fuel depots exploded in chain reactions visible for miles. It wasn't strategy in the traditional sense, it was pure, sustained pressure, crushing Germany's war machine from every direction. The Luftwaffe, already bleeding pilots faster than they could train replacements, now faced another nightmare: destruction on the ground. Every road, every supply column, every airfield within Thunderbolt range became a potential death zone. Even German generals began to acknowledge it. One report from 1944 bluntly stated, "Where the Thunderbolt operates, our movement by day is impossible." The Thunderbolt had evolved beyond a fighter. It was a force multiplier, a symbol of overwhelming industrial and tactical superiority. And behind every sortie, behind every mission, stood the men who flew her. Pilots who learned to trust the Jug not just as a machine, but as a shield, a weapon, and a promise that they would return home alive. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy roared with chaos. Artillery, machine guns, the thunder of waves crashing against steel. But above the smoke, another sound dominated the battlefield: the growling whine of Pratt and Whitney engines. The P-47 Thunderbolts had arrived. They came in waves, low and fast, their wings bristling with rockets and .50 caliber machine guns. While infantry struggled through barbed wire and machine gun nests, Thunderbolts turned German strongpoints into smoking ruins. Bridges, fuel depots, and armored columns vanished beneath precise, relentless airstrikes. Soldiers on the ground called them angels with 8 guns. Unlike many fighters built for clean, high-altitude duels, the P-47 thrived in the dirty, unpredictable air of ground combat. It could dive almost vertically, unleash a storm of fire, then pull up through curtains of flak that would have shredded lesser aircraft. Pilots often returned with holes in their wings big enough to crawl through, and still landed safely. Its rugged frame and air-cooled engine made it nearly immune to small arms fire. Allied tank crews quickly realized, if a Thunderbolt was overhead, survival odds multiplied. The coordination between armor and air became seamless. Commanders began calling in JBOs, short for Jag Bomber, to wipe out ambushes before tanks even saw them. In the weeks after D-Day, as the Allies pushed through France, P-47s turned the roadways into graveyards of German armor. Convoys that tried to move by daylight rarely made it past noon. Every strafing run left behind wreckage, burnt-out half-tracks, shattered tanks, columns of black smoke marking the Jug's passing. It was a force multiplier, a symbol of overwhelming industrial and tactical superiority. And behind every sortie, behind every mission, stood the men who flew her. Pilots who learned to trust the Jug not just as a machine, but as a shield, a weapon, and a promise that they would return home alive. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy roared with chaos. Artillery, machine guns, the thunder of waves crashing against steel. But above the smoke, another sound dominated the battlefield: the growling whine of Pratt and Whitney engines. The P-47 Thunderbolts had arrived. They came in waves, low and fast, their wings bristling with rockets and .50 caliber machine guns. While infantry struggled through barbed wire and machine gun nests, Thunderbolts turned German strongpoints into smoking ruins. Bridges, fuel depots, and armored columns vanished beneath precise, relentless airstrikes. Soldiers on the ground called them angels with 8 guns. Unlike many fighters built for clean, high-altitude duels, the P-47 thrived in the dirty, unpredictable air of ground combat. It could dive almost vertically, unleash a storm of fire, then pull up through curtains of flak that would have shredded lesser aircraft. Pilots often returned with holes in their wings big enough to crawl through, and still landed safely. Its rugged frame and air-cooled engine made it nearly immune to small arms fire. Allied tank crews quickly realized, if a Thunderbolt was overhead, survival odds multiplied. The coordination between armor and air became seamless. Commanders began calling in JBOs, short for Jag Bomber, to wipe out ambushes before tanks even saw them. In the weeks after D-Day, as the Allies pushed through France, P-47s turned the roadways into graveyards of German armor. Convoys that tried to move by daylight rarely made it past noon. Every strafing run left behind wreckage, burnt-out half-tracks, shattered tanks, columns of black smoke marking the jugs passing. By late summer, the German army faced an invisible leash. Movement by day was suicide. And at night, the fear remained, because everyone knew dawn meant one thing: the Thunderbolts were coming again. The P-47 wasn't glamorous like the Spitfire, nor sleek like the Mustang, but it was the soldier's plane, a brute-force guardian angel that fought dirty, hit hard, and never stopped coming. It wasn't just air power anymore. It was air dominance. By the time the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had flown more than 500,000 combat sorties. It had destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft, tens of thousands of vehicles, and countless trains and artillery positions. But numbers alone could never define what it represented. The Jug, as its pilots affectionately called it, stood as living proof of a new kind of warfare, one not merely won in the skies, but in the factories. For German engineers who once dismantled William Roach's captured Thunderbolt, the aircraft remained a symbol of everything they could never match. Its power wasn't born from genius alone, but from an industrial machine capable of producing perfection by the tens of thousands. Every bolt, every weld, every polished surface spoke of abundance, of a nation that could afford to outbuild, outlast, and outfly any rival.
The Thunderbolt's legacy stretched beyond the war.
In its roar echoed the birth of the jet age, the understanding that altitude, speed, and survivability demanded new materials, new fuels, and new philosophies. Engineers who studied its systems carried those lessons into the design of early American jets, the F-86 Sabre and beyond. The P-47 had been the bridge between piston power and jet propulsion, between the old world of dueling aces and the new era of strategic air dominance. For the men who flew it, the Thunderbolt was more than a machine. It was a companion that brought them home when logic said they should have died.